Johnny Cash once said, "Bob Dylan and I were cut from the same cloth, just from different corners of it." It was the early 1960s. Johnny, already the man in black, was rising fast in country music, while Bob Dylan, a young folk singer from Minnesota, was stirring hearts with songs that felt like poetry from another world. When Cash first heard "Blowin' in the Wind," he was struck silent. He told June Carter, "This boy's got something real. Something you can't fake." Dylan's words carried the weight of truth, something Johnny had always chased in his own songs. At a time when Nashville was filled with polished, radio-friendly sounds, both men stood apart. Johnny sang about prisons, pain, and redemption. Dylan sang about injustice, restlessness, and freedom. They weren't chasing fame, they were chasing honesty. Their paths were destined to cross. And when they finally did, it wasn't in a recording studio or award show. It was backstage, two tired souls meeting after long roads and long nights. Johnny looked at Dylan and said simply, "Son, you're the real deal." Dylan smiled shyly. He had grown up listening to Johnny's records. The mutual respect was instant. In that moment, two generations of American songwriters found common ground, not in style but in spirit. Cash would later say, "Bob wasn't trying to be country, and I wasn't trying to be folk. But we both were trying to tell the truth." It was the beginning of a lifelong brotherhood, built on faith, freedom, and music that never lied. By the late 1960s, Bob Dylan was looking for a change. He had become a voice for a generation, but the weight of fame and protest had grown heavy. He wanted simplicity, peace, authenticity. So where did he go? Nashville, Johnny Cash's territory. At first, people thought Dylan had lost his mind. Nashville was known for rhinestones and twang, not protest songs and poetic riddles. But Johnny Cash saw the move as genius. He said, Bob came to Nashville because he wanted to find the roots. He wasn't running away, he was going home. Cash personally helped Dylan navigate the town. He introduced him to the session players, the engineers, the rhythm of country recording. When Dylan walked into Columbia Studio A to record Blonde on Blonde, many musicians were skeptical until he started singing. The room changed. The sound was raw, unpredictable, and emotional. Exactly what Johnny loved. Cash visited Dylan during these sessions, quietly sitting in the back. He didn't interfere, he just listened. After one take, he reportedly told Dylan, "Don't let anyone clean that up. That's your soul talking." Dylan would later call Johnny a guide. Someone who showed him that country music wasn't about formulas, it was about honesty. And in return, Cash said, Bob made us all braver. He made country boys believe their words mattered too. The Nashville scene would never be the same again. Thanks to Dylan, and thanks to the man who stood by him. Critics mocked Dylan's singing voice from day one. They called it nasal, flat, and untrained. But Johnny Cash heard something entirely different. He once said, when Bob Dylan sings, he's not trying to sound pretty, he's trying to sound true. And that's a much harder thing to do. Cash had always defended artists who didn't fit the mold. He knew what it was like to be rejected for not sounding radio perfect. When Nashville executives laughed at Dylan's phrasing, Cash told them, that voice comes from the same place as Hank Williams' deep pain. Cash's respect wasn't just about Dylan's writing, it was about his bravery. Dylan didn't hide behind studio polish. He sang with the cracks, the rasp, and the imperfection that made his songs human. Johnny understood that, because he did the same. During interviews, Cash often pointed out that Dylan's voice carried a lifetime in every line, even though he was still young. He told reporters, Bob's voice ain't about melody. It's about meaning. You feel what he feels. That's what real music is. Years later, when asked to describe Dylan in one word, Cash said simply, honest. And when Cash recorded his own stripped-down albums in his final years, many noticed how much Dylan's influence lingered in his voice, pure, raw, unfiltered truth. Before they ever met in person, Johnny Cash wrote Bob Dylan a letter. It was 1962. Cash had been listening to Dylan's debut album, and he couldn't shake it off. The words, the delivery, it all felt like something ancient and sacred. So he sat down and wrote, "You've got the kind of truth that doesn't wear out. I feel it. Keep walking your road. You've got a friend in me." Dylan, overwhelmed, later said it was one of the first times an established artist had ever reached out to him with respect. He wrote back to Johnny, thanking him and calling him a North Star for men like me. That letter sparked a friendship long before their first handshake. They were fans of each other's courage. Cash admired Dylan's lyricism, and Dylan admired Johnny's moral backbone, the way he stood up for prisoners, the poor, and the broken. When they finally did meet a few years later, both already felt like they knew the other's heart. Dylan told him, "You were writing folk songs before I even knew what a folk song was." Cash laughed and replied, "And you're writing gospel songs without even saying the word God." That first exchange became the seed of a lifelong connection, two souls who didn't follow trends, but followed the truth. When Johnny Cash first brought Bob Dylan to meet his family, June Carter said she instantly saw the bond. Dylan was quiet, polite, and deeply curious. He asked questions about Johnny's roots, his faith, and his early life picking cotton in Arkansas. Johnny told his kids, "This man's a poet, a real one. He don't write songs, he writes truths." And to his friends, Cash said, "He's one of us, a country boy, even if he don't sound like one." The two men would spend hours talking about faith, sin, and redemption, the three things both had been wrestling with their entire lives. Dylan's words fascinated Cash. They weren't always literal, but they cut deep. And Johnny could see the same hunger for redemption that burned inside him. Once after dinner, Dylan played "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right" on Johnny's porch. When he finished, Cash just nodded and said softly, "That's what truth sounds like when it hurts." Dylan later said, "Johnny treated me like family. I learned from him that music doesn't need a label, it needs a heart." From that moment on, whenever Dylan visited Nashville, there was always a seat at Johnny's table, and a bond that fame could never shake. In 1969, something magical happened in Nashville. Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash walked into Columbia's studio together and walked out with one of the most beautiful duets in history, "Girl from the North Country." The session was raw, simple, and unplanned. 2 microphones, 2 voices, no ego. Cash said later, "We didn't rehearse much. We just sang. That's all we needed." Their voices couldn't have been more different, Dylan's fragile and haunting, Johnny's deep and grounded. Yet together, they sounded like two sides of the same story. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation between old souls. Dylan had first written "Girl from a North Country" years earlier as a young man remembering lost love. But with Johnny beside him, the song took on a new meaning, about time, friendship, and memories that never fade. June Carter stood in the control room with tears in her eyes. "It sounded like two brothers saying goodbye," she said. For many fans, that recording became one of the purest moments in both their careers. No flashy production, no fancy tricks, just emotion, honesty, and timeless simplicity. Cash later said, "When Bob and I sang that song, I felt peace. Like we'd said something that would last longer than both of us." And he was right. Decades later, that performance still gives chills, because it wasn't just music. It was love between two men who understood pain and turned it into art. Johnny Cash and Bob Dylan didn't always talk often, but when they did, every word mattered. Their friendship was never built on fame, it was built on honesty. Both had walked through darkness. Johnny had battled addiction, guilt, and loss. Dylan had faced backlash, crashes, and isolation. They didn't pity each other, they simply understood. Cash once said, "Bob and I never talked about the spotlight. We talked about the shadows." They admired each other's courage to keep telling the truth when the world wanted comfort. Dylan wrote about injustice and hypocrisy. Cash sang about sin and salvation. Both knew truth was dangerous, but necessary. Once, when a journalist asked Cash why he loved Dylan so much, he replied, "Because he never lied to us. Not once." Dylan, in his own quiet way, returned that respect. He told friends that Cash was the only country singer who could preach without preaching. Their honesty connected them in a world of showbiz masks and fake smiles. They were rebels, but not for rebellion's sake, for sincerity's sake. And as the years went on, their friendship turned into something like spiritual brotherhood. Cash said, "We both came from dust. We just found different ways to tell the story." When they shared a stage or a song, you could feel that unspoken bond, two men who had walked through fire and still believed in truth. In the late 1960s, when Bob Dylan went electric and country radio turned on him, Johnny Cash stood his ground. While critics mocked Dylan's change in sound, Cash defended him publicly, over and over again at the 1969 Country Music Association Awards. Johnny said something that silenced a whole crowd. "If Bob Dylan's not country, then maybe we've forgotten what country really means." He meant it. To Cash, country wasn't about banjos or boots, it was about real life, real pain, and real words. And Dylan had that in spades. Cash invited Dylan to appear on the Johnny Cash Show, a huge national platform. When executives hesitated, Cash refused to back down. "If Bob ain't welcome, I ain't hosting," he said. Dylan appeared performing I Threw It All Away, and Living the Blues. Millions watched. Suddenly, Dylan was embraced again by country and folk fans alike. That act of loyalty changed Dylan's public image forever. And years later, Dylan said, "Johnny Cash stood by me when it wasn't popular. I never forgot that." Cash didn't do it for headlines. He did it because he believed in authenticity. He later told June, "When a man's telling the truth, you stand beside him, even if the crowd don't." And that's what made Johnny Cash not just a legend, but a true friend. In 1966, after Dylan's motorcycle crash, he vanished from the public eye. No concerts, no interviews, just silence. The world speculated endlessly. But Johnny Cash didn't pry. Instead, he wrote a letter that it wasn't long, just a few lines. "Bob, if you're hurting, don't rush back. The world can wait. Truth can't be forced. It comes back when it's ready." Dylan later said that letter meant more than any award. "Johnny knew what pain felt like," he said softly. "He didn't send advice, he sent peace." Cash never shared that letter publicly. He respected privacy like sacred ground. He knew Dylan wasn't hiding, he was healing. Cash told a friend, "When a man's been through the storm, the kindest thing you can do is keep his name out your mouth." Years later, Dylan thanked him personally, saying, "You were the only one who didn't demand something from me." To Johnny, that was what friendship meant, standing quietly in someone's corner when the world grows loud. And when Cash went through his own battles with addiction and illness later, Dylan returned that same grace, never speaking about Johnny's struggles, only his strength. Their friendship wasn't loud or dramatic. It was made of letters, songs, and silence, the kind that only real friends understand. Johnny Cash believed some things were too sacred for the public eye. When reporters asked about Dylan's reclusive years or his private life, Johnny always gave the same answer: "Ask Bob. It's his story." He knew what it was like to be misunderstood by headlines. He'd lived through scandals, addiction, and recovery. Cash said, "People forget we're human. They want saints or sinners, not men who are both." So, when Dylan disappeared for stretches of time, Cash refused to speculate. Instead, he played Dylan's songs on the radio, quietly keeping his friend's name alive. In one interview, Cash said, "Bob's silence speaks louder than most people's songs." It was that respect, rare in the music world, that held their bond together. Cash didn't need to explain Dylan to the world. He just needed to honor him. Dylan later told Rolling Stone, "Johnny Cash never used my name for attention. He protected it." And that perhaps is why Dylan attended Cash's funeral years later, quietly, sitting in the back, head bowed, that he didn't speak to cameras. He didn't perform. He just whispered to June, "He always understood me." For both men, friendship meant silence when words weren't needed.